What's up guys, it's Thunderstruck115, and today we're going to be taking a look at the past year in gaming. Now initially I wanted to do like a sort of top 5 games that released this year, but then I realized that there are so many games that released this year that I haven't played, which among others includes Baldur's Gate 3. So I figured, why not instead focus on the games I did play? So this video I'm going to be going through the year and talking about the games that I played this year and giving my thoughts on them. This isn't really serious or anything, I just figured it'd be a fun way to end off the year. I will also say a game doesn't have to have released this year for me to mention it here. If there's a game that released years ago that I didn't play or didn't play much, then I'll talk about it here. Also, since I played some games in the form that weren't conducive to recording, such as on the Switch or the Steam Deck, I will be borrowing footage for some of these games. If the gameplay footage I'm using is not my own, I will put a text blurb on the screen saying where I got it from, and I'll link it in the description. I will try to go in chronological order, but seeing as I didn't write any of this shit down anywhere, there might be a few discrepancies, but I doubt y'all will care about that anyway, so let's go ahead and start off with the 2 games that I got for Christmas last year. Now, Devil May Cry 5 Special Edition is technically just an enhanced re-release of Devil May Cry 5, which I actually did play the original release on Xbox One late last year, and I do find it a bit scummy that Capcom is locking the next-gen improvements behind another $40 purchase, but seeing as Special Edition comes with all the DLC for the game, which I was already kind of eyeing anyway, I figured, fuck it, why not get the next-gen improvements while I'm at it. 120 FPS is really nice in this game, but the new content is the star of the show here. I tried out Virgil, and he quickly became my favorite character. His combos are so fun to pull off, and nothing is more satisfying than pulling off the Judgment Cut end to finish off a fight. Surprisingly, I also really enjoyed Legendary Dark Knight mode. I say surprisingly because I sucked ass at Son of Sparta difficulty, and Legendary Dark Knight is literally just that, but with a lot more enemies. But there's a lot of satisfaction to be had in cutting down so many of them at once. There's also new arms for Nero, which I thought the Mega Buster was pretty cool, but the rest of them are just reskins of other ones that are already in the game, except for the Sweet Surrender, which is basically fucking useless. Still, I had a ton of fun with this game. Now, I'm not particularly amazing at it, and you can probably tell from my gameplay footage, but I enjoyed it very much. If you like action games, then this is a strong recommend from me. Now, let's look at the other game I got for Christmas. Call of Duty Modern Warfare 2 2022, which, for the sake of not having to say that over and over, I'm just going to shorten it to Modern Warfare 22. Overall, I think it's actually a pretty good Call of Duty. Now, when it comes to the campaign, usually my enjoyment of it is directly related more to the story than it is the gameplay, seeing as Call of Duty's combat loop in PvE isn't exactly that deep, and I usually only play it once before never touching it again for the next several years until the story is somewhat foggy in my mind. But with Modern Warfare 22, I actually think that this was actually pretty fun from a gameplay standpoint, and that's mainly because of the variety of the mission design. I thought Recon by Fire was a really fun sniping mission that made good use of the new engine, while also giving you plenty of choices to clear out the different buildings. Dark Water was actually a really fun reimagining of the ship mission from COD 4 and the oil rig mission from Modern Warfare 2, and I especially love how the cargo containers on the ship would slide back and forth, which served as a hazard while also making the battle more dynamic. Violence and timing was actually really cool as you jump from vehicle to vehicle while fighting enemies. Ghost Team was a fairly standard mission, but it had a really fun fight against a tank at the end. And Close Air is probably the most fun I've had with an AC-130 mission in the Call of Duty game, seeing as I can actually level the buildings with the AC-130. I feel like the character interactions in this game were also pretty cool. The banter between Ghost and Soap in the mission alone was pretty cool. I thought Graves had a lot of really cool personality as well, and it's nice to see that Ghost is actually his own character rather than just a copy-paste of Gaz from COD 4. Unfortunately, when it comes to the actual story, it sucks ass. The first half of the game is all about finding and capturing Hassan, but then you have to let him go because it's fucking illegal or some shit. Never mind the fact that we literally just decimated an entire village with an AC-130 and killed God knows how many people of the Mexican army. Also, spoilers for anybody that cares. But the betrayal scene was just done really poorly. Even if I didn't play the original Modern Warfare 2 and figured they'd try something similar here, I still would have seen it coming from a mile away. And outside of one really cool detail where the subtitle name for Graves changes from blue to red at the moment he betrays you, yeah, this scene sucks ass. Meanwhile, I haven't seen an ending for a game that's as unsatisfying and on a cliffhanger since fucking Halo 2. So yeah, gameplay in the campaign is well above average for Call of Duty, PvP. Story, though, sucks ass. What about the multiplayer? Well, I can't believe I'm saying this, but this is probably the most fun I've had with a Call of Duty multiplayer since Black Ops 2 back in 2012. They nailed damn near everything here. The pacing feels great, the weapons sandbox is overall really well balanced for the most part. The map design, while I wouldn't really say it goes above and beyond like, say, Black Ops 2, it's still really fucking solid all around. The equipment, ooh, the equipment, I love it so much. The shock stick is far more creative here than it was in Black Ops 2, and my personal new favorite piece of equipment is the drill charge. You got a camper in the building, just stick it on the wall outside of where they're at, let it drill through, and boom. They also fixed my issue with the attachment unlocks in Black Ops Cold War and Modern Warfare 2019, because once you unlock an attachment on one gun, it unlocks for every gun, and because there's so many, it doesn't feel too overpowered. I suppose I could see why some people don't like the way that guns unlock in this game, but I personally didn't really have a problem with it. I struggle to think of criticisms for this game's multiplayer. I mean, maybe the kill streaks are a bit vanilla, and I mean, the new perk system is kind of weird, and the user interface is fucking awful, but overall, I think Modern Warfare 22 has one of the best multiplayer components we've received in a long time. And then there's Spec Ops. Is it better than Modern Warfare 2019? Yes, but that's not exactly a high bar. While a lot of the balancing issues are gone from there, I still find the missions to just be kind of bland. Like, remember in the original Modern Warfare 2 where you had to stealth your way through an airbase and plant charges? Or you had to guide a striker? Remember in Modern Warfare 3 when you guided a fucking tank? I just don't really see that same kind of creativity here, at least not from the missions I played. While I'd hesitate to call it bad, I also just don't really care about it that much. And then this game had Warzone 2.0, which I fell hard off of Battle Royales back in 2019, so I just don't give a shit. Overall, I'd recommend this game if you're looking for a good multiplayer component, or if you're looking for a campaign whose gameplay is more varied than typical COD fare. But if you're looking for a well-written story, or for a good Spec Ops mode, I wouldn't really say this is worth the purchase. So what's next? Well, in late January, GoldenEye 64 saw a re-release on Xbox Series consoles, Xbox One, and the Nintendo Switch via the NSO expansion pack. Since it was included on Game Pass, I figured I'd check it out. Let's talk positives first. The game is now in 4K widescreen, which is nice, and it fixed my biggest issue with the original, that being the controls. We have the dual analog control scheme that you'd expect, but surprisingly, they also fixed the god-awful precision aiming controls of the original. The way precision aim worked in the original is that your crosshair would move around the screen by partially holding down the thumbstick, but if you moved it towards the edges, your viewport would shift. This might not sound too bad on paper, but as somebody who has actually used this control scheme, it fucking sucks. The re-release, however, keeps the precision aim crosshair in the center of the screen and just shifts your entire viewport by using the thumbstick, kind of like how modern shooters work. And let me tell you, this change greatly improves the experience. Now, if only the rest of the re-release got this much love. Even though that there's a scrapped Xbox 360 version with greatly improved visuals, the game still looks the same as it did in 1997. Okay, not too bad I suppose, until you realize that the game is also still stuck at 30 FPS. And what's even worse, it's not even a consistent 30 FPS. We live in a world where we can get visually impressive open-world games like Far Cry 6 or Halo Infinite running at 4K 60 FPS on the Xbox Series X. Meanwhile, Code Mystics couldn't get a game from 1997 to run at a stable 30. And don't tell me it's some limitation of emulation either. If I've been able to run this game at 60 FPS using the 1964 emulator since fucking 2015, then there is no reason why they couldn't have got it to run at 60 FPS here, even with emulation. Furthermore, text and the HUD elements are still using 240p screenshots, there's no online multiplayer, and if you bought Rare Replay physically, you don't get the game. It's only for those who either own the game digitally or are subscribed to Game Pass. Yeah, the remaster that was supposed to release on the Xbox 360 in 2007, but never did due to licensing issues, is far better and more polished than this. And I know this might be a bit of a hot take, but I'm just gonna say it. I really don't think GoldenEye is quite the masterpiece a lot of people claim it is. Don't get me wrong, I think it was a good enough shooter for the time, especially considering that console shooters from that era tended to suck because of the controls, but I find the design to be pretty boring. Like, I can go back to a game like Doom or Quake and have a really fun time, but GoldenEye, even with the better controls of this re-release, just still bores me. Enemies aren't particularly engaging, there's not much variety, the weapons aren't creative, I find the secret agent espionage elements to be kind of half half-baked. The only thing I can really say I truly enjoy a lot about GoldenEye is the multiplayer, because yeah, it's jank, but it's equally jank for everybody, and it creates fun in a sort of Mario Kart sort of way, if that makes sense. But again, even that was botched due to the lack of online multiplayer. And I know some people are going to say that technically the Switch version has online multiplayer, but really it's just a fucking netplay feature that Nintendo has built into their emulators for NSO, and if you've ever used that, you'll know it sucks ass. On one hand, it is nice that there is an official and convenient way to play this game in the modern age, but this re-release just overall felt really fucking lazy, and if you want a better experience with this game, I just recommend downloading the specialized build of the 1964 emulator that allows you to play GoldenEye with mouse and keyboard controls, while also including other enhancements like 60 FPS and redrawn HUD elements. If you have Game Pass or already own a digital copy of Rare Replay, or are already subscribed to NSO Expansion Pack, this is a nice addition, but there are definitely better ways to play GoldenEye. Well, around this time, Xbox hosted a presentation, and the highlight was the shadow drop of a new game called Hi-Fi Rush, a rhythm-based melee combat game that basically combines Devil May Cry and Guitar Hero. This game reminds me of a game that would have released during the GameCube era in all the right ways. It's got a creative and unique gameplay loop and premise, the art style is really nice, has a really cool soundtrack, and it doesn't overstay its welcome. It's only about like 10 hours or so, but from what I've heard, it's a fun 10 hours. Now you might have noticed I said, from what I've heard, and the reason for that's because I've only played the first 3 levels. Yeah, I hate to say it, but I think I unintentionally sabotaged my own fun with this game because, in my hubris, I picked hard difficulty. And maybe if this is a straight-up action combat game like Devil May Cry, I might have been able to handle that. Thing is, I've never played a rhythm game before, and don't let the cutesy art style fool ya, this game is challenging. I really enjoyed what I played, but I think the game was getting too challenging for me, and I think the idea of just restarting on a lower difficulty just sort of put me off from trying again, which, to be clear, that's not the game's fault by any stretch of the imagination. But enough time has passed, so, you know, I think I'll go back to it and just restart the game on, like, medium or something, and maybe I'll have a much better time. But I would definitely recommend this game, just know that it's gonna be more challenging than usual. This isn't the case like most modern games where hard difficulty is the new normal. The shadow drop of Hi-Fi Rush was a surprise for everybody. But it wouldn't be long before we got yet another shadow drop, this time from Nintendo, of Metroid Prime Remastered. Within 24 hours of the game's release, I already had it bought digitally on my Switch and I was playing it. The goal of the remaster was to simply overhaul the visuals and controls and provide a few quality of life options, but otherwise provide the same experience that you would have got back on the GameCube in 2002. And with that scope in mind, I think Metroid Prime Remastered is a near-perfect remaster of an old classic. I never realized just how much dual analog controls help this game until I actually got to play with it in this remaster, and it is so nice, especially during some of the boss fights. And then there's the visuals. Oh god, the visuals, they are beautiful. This is easily my pick for best looking game on the Nintendo Switch. In fact, it looks so good that a lot of the times, I forget that it's running on the Switch. Like, I'd say it's comparable to something like Halo 2 Anniversary from the Xbox One. And it does such an excellent job of updating the assets while preserving the original art style. The sound design is exactly the same as it was on the GameCube, but seeing as that was already perfect as it was, I'm glad they kept it the same. There's really only one issue I have with this as a remaster, and that's the fact that there are some sequence-breaking tricks that were in the GameCube original that are patched out of this remaster, such as the scan dash. I should note, though, that this isn't something new to the remaster, seeing as these sequence-breaking tricks were also patched out of the PAL release on the GameCube, the Player's Choice re-release on the GameCube, and the re-release included with Metroid Prime Trilogy on the Wii. Seeing as this is Metroid, a series that prides itself on player freedom, and usually embraces these sequence-breaking tricks, it's kind of disappointing to see them gone in the remaster. It's not like these are hurting casual players who don't wish to use them. It's not like you're walking through the Talon overworld and then fall through the floor and into the impact crater. You have to go out of your way to use them. And it's a shame to see them removed, although there are some sequence breaks that still do exist here. And even then, it's not like I own the original GameCube release. The version I have on the GameCube is the Player's Choice version. And I can definitely say I definitely enjoyed my time with this game more here than I did on my first GameCube playthrough back in 2021. There is some knowledge that helps, like knowing that I can kill the Chozo Ghost with super missiles, and the fact that I found all 4 charge combos before facing the final boss while also stocking up on a fuck ton of missiles meant that I could abuse the beam combos to make it a lot less tedious. Despite that though, this game reminded me a lot of what I like about Metroid Prime 1, but Also, what I don't like about it, that being the severe pacing issues, there's still a ton, and I mean a ton, of backtracking, which granted exists in every Metroid game, but in Prime 1 particularly, I feel like it was done really poorly, as oftentimes the game will send you from one side of the map to the other to grab an item that you solely need to go back to the spot you were at originally, so you can actually use it to see something new. And I've had to backtrack through Magmore Caverns so many fucking times that I could probably do it blindfolded at this point. And of course, bosses like Thardus, Meta Ridley, the Hive Mecha, and the Incinerator Drone are still tedious as hell and really fucking easy. And while I did try to grab as many artifacts as I could earlier than intended, it still was a pretty tedious hunt at the end of the game. Now, to be clear, I like Metroid Prime 1. I really do. And if you haven't played any of the Metroid Prime games before, I would absolutely recommend this remaster. However, I still think that Prime 2 is the vastly superior game due to fixing the pacing issues, and I would like to see a remaster of that, and Prime 3 as well. Still, Retro Studios did an amazing job remastering this old classic, though, and I had a fun time with it, even if I don't think I'm going to replay it anytime soon. But while we're revisiting old classics, let's take a trip back to 2005 with F.E.A.R. I heard a lot of good things about this game, especially the enemy AI, and I wanted to check it out. Unfortunately, if you want to play the Steam version, you have to buy the entire collection because you can't buy this game standalone. So I did because it was on sale for like $5. Now, I usually don't play slower-paced tactical shooters like this, but F.E.A.R. is still so much fucking fun. Every bit of praise the AI gets, it deserves. I remember being blown away in an early encounter where I was hiding behind a truck for cover, only for an enemy soldier to crawl under the truck and blast me in the nuts. And that's when I realized that the AI in a lot of first-person shooters nowadays really suck, because I never would have anticipated that until it happened. I love the battle chatter where they feel formidable, yet they still feel like they're actual soldiers and will freak the fuck out if you gun down their squads. The weapons are really satisfying, the sound design is satisfying, fights are intense and tight, and it's a really fun experience all around. I will say, the level design in the base game tends to feel a little bit repetitive, as most of it is either industrial or office environments, although near the end of the game you do start encountering some lab environments as well. I also didn't really find the story too engaging outside the end of it and the big reveal. Like, I don't think it's bad, I do think it's a story that functions, it's just not really something that grips me. I also found the horror elements to be mildly enjoyable, but I don't really think they went above and beyond, in my opinion. Then again, that might just be because I don't really scare easy from video games, so that might have something to do with it. More recently, I actually started playing its first expansion, Extraction Point. Now, unfortunately, I've been running into a ton of technical problems with it and trying to get it to not crash, but the design is absolutely amazing. The level design is a lot more varied, but it plays really well to F.E.A.R's strengths. There's new guns, there's the new turret equipment, and the horror elements are better here. Like, there was a scene in the second interval that I genuinely found fucking horrifying. Now, I haven't played the Perseus Mandate expansion yet, so I can't really comment on that, but the gameplay is genuinely fucking gripping, and I would recommend it to any fan of shooters. The only thing is that if you're playing this game on PC, I'd highly recommend installing dinput 8.dll, as it helps the performance not be complete dog shit on modern operating systems. Now, when April rolled around, we saw the release of one of my most anticipated games this year, Everspace 2. Now, technically, I had played the game back in 2021 in early access, but then I hit a major story moment that was kinda ruined for me due to the fact that the cutscene wasn't entirely finished, so they just had a narrator explain what happened. So at that point, I just decided I would wait until the full game released, and I'm glad I did, because there are plenty of improvements I spotted over early access. Now, the first game was a roguelike, and this game is instead an open-world looter shooter, so it's gonna be easier by default, but I found early access to be too easy, and I'm glad that that's pretty much fixed here. I love the improvements to this game's combat loop over the first one. Giving me separate energy bars for my weapons versus my boosters is really nice. The rework to devices in this game means I find myself using them a lot more often. There are far more weapons to play with, and they are far more creative and varied. And a lot of the weapons from the first game are improved. Like, for example, the scattergun, which is basically fucking useless in the first game, is actually quite fun to use here. There's more enemy variety to be had, and the locations that you fight in are a lot more memorable, due in large part to the fact that you're fighting in a lot of handcrafted areas instead of everything being procedurally generated. There's more ships to play with that provide different playstyles, like there's a drone carrier ship that you can use. Personally, I found myself favoring the bomber. And there's plenty of content to be had here, both procedurally generated and handcrafted. Pretty much all the procedurally generated content is optional, but there's plenty of handcrafted content to be had here to make it worth the money. When it comes to procedurally generated content, I love the ancient rifts and the high-risk areas, as those are basically just intense combat encounters, which I love. Unfortunately, shit like the distress signals or the GMB jobs are less than satisfying. Thankfully, you can ignore those without any real consequence. Additionally, the characters are a lot better as well. Like, the only character I really cared that much about in Everspace 1 was Hive. A lot of the others just felt kinda bland or cheap. Everspace 2 gives them much more distinct personalities, and there are many times when these characters made me fucking laugh my ass off. Of course, there are a few unfortunate shortcomings. The plot and story is not particularly memorable. It's not bad, but it feels like they weren't sure what they wanted to do with the story, and it just didn't really come together in a satisfying way. Number 2, some of the location challenges aren't particularly engaging. Like, I think this game is at its best when it forces you to engage in its combat loop, but not all of the location challenges really do that. Some of them require you to solve some puzzle, and a lot of the puzzles in this game aren't particularly all that great. In most cases, it's pretty harmless, but there are a few instances where it's just annoying, where you need to get, like, the fucking rotator blocks for the ancient devices, but you can't fucking find them, search as you might, and it just sorta takes forever. And probably my biggest issue is some of the pacing problems, particularly travel times and slip space. Basically, the game isn't one contiguous open galaxy, but rather a bunch of solar systems, each with different locations that you can visit. You go to these locations in super light, but once you select where you want to go, you're just sort of sitting there waiting to arrive at your destination. And when the place you need to go is on the opposite side of the solar system you're currently in, or God forbid, in a different solar system, so you need to go to the jump gate, it can really add up to quite a bit of just empty downtime. Thankfully, this does improve greatly in the back half of the game because you can unlock a perk for each individual solar system where you can speed up super light travel, an ability that I really think you should have just had by default instead of having to unlock. And halfway through the game, you get access to the spatial bypass, which lets you fast travel between any system. And those two things together greatly improve the pacing, but it's a shame that I had to suffer through poor pacing in the first half of the game to get there. None of these flaws are particularly game-breaking, but drag down the experience of what is an otherwise really good game. For a while, I thought this was my second favorite game this year, but some of the issues I feel like drag it down just a little bit more. I'd say it's a solid 7 or 8 out of 10. Still, I definitely think it's well worth the purchase and better than a certain other space game that we'll talk about later. The devil's greatest trick was convincing the world he didn't exist. Redfall. Saying that this game is bad would be the understatement of the goddamn century. It has a really cool premise, an open-world co-op game where you fight vampires. And it's made by Arcane Studios. That's really cool. It's just a shame that they royally screwed up in every area imaginable. The combat loop is just bad. The enemy AI is just fucking dumb, as they'll forget where you are if you so much as go around a fucking light pole. Meanwhile, vampires will just run at you, so you just gotta walk backwards and shoot at them until you can stake them. And despite the limitless potential to be had here, the enemy variety is just fucking pathetic. You have regular cultists, vampires, and these watcher fuckers. The only other enemy type I can remember are the blood bags, which only appeared in one mission, which thankfully, when I went back to this game in October after the 60 FPS update, it didn't break on me like it did the first time. Yeah, I tried playing this game again after the October update after they added 60 FPS to the Series X version. And there are some improvements. The performance is fixed, there aren't as many visual bugs, so it doesn't give me fucking epilepsy anymore. And there are more enemies to be found in the open world. Unfortunately, that fact only emphasizes just how much I hate this game's combat loop, because I still find myself trying to avoid combat when possible. And this confirms what I thought back in May. Even if you were to fix all the technical problems in this game and make it run buttery smooth at 4K 120 FPS, it would not matter. Because besides that, every other criticism that I had initially is still just as true now. You can keep throwing yourselves at the enemies over and over, because even if you die, the enemies that you kill kill will stay dead, so you can just keep respawning at the nearest safe house and killing them over and over until they die. And this isn't something you can turn off even if you want to try and have to play more smart. Despite having the coolest premise, the open world is boring as fuck. Content is spread way too far apart. You can't enter most of the buildings like you could in something like Dishonored. The abilities aren't really all that interesting. This game still has a tonal dissonance as it tries simultaneously to be a more serious and gritty game, portraying the world as just completely fucked because of the vampires, but at the same time it also tries to be quirky and humorous with the fucking protagonist cracking unfunny jokes all the time. NPCs are literally there just to fucking be there. The boss fights are underwhelming. Aim assist is inconsistent as all hell. The guns feel even stiffer than fucking Deathloop, if you can believe it. The story presentation is just flat and lifeless. And I'm just gonna be honest, I cannot remember the last time I played a game that was just this obscenely bad. Maybe 007 Legends from 2012, but even then I thought that was more fun than this. And you know, maybe it's better in co-op, but the problem is, there's no fucking matchmaking like there is in Borderlands. So if I wanted to play co-op, I would have to ask one of my friends to play it with me, and the only reason I'd ever ask anybody to play this game is if I actively wanted to torture them. Oh, and I almost forgot, but you still need an online connection even if you just want to play single player, and you can't pause the game in single player. Look, I gave the game a second chance after the October update, and it was still a fucking dumpster fire, so yeah, I just uninstalled this game from my Xbox, and I'm washing my hands completely of this game. And honestly, even if Arcane announced tomorrow that they were about to release the best update of all time, I would not care. So yeah, do yourselves all a favor and stay the fuck away from this game. So, in the middle of May, my older brother approached me and asked me that if he bought a multiplayer game, would I buy it and play it with him? And naturally, I said yes. The game in question is a real-time strategy game known as Line War. The premise is interesting. Instead of giving units orders in the conventional way that you would in a game like Command & Conquer, Age of Empires, or StarCraft, instead you give line orders on the battlefield and your units will follow into these. I know that doesn't sound exciting, but there's actually a bit more depth than you might initially think. You can choose your orders to be more offensive or defensive in posture, whether they should stop to attack enemies or just power through, or if they should get dug in. The game requires you to capture territories both to generate income as well as to build structures. There's two main resources you have to balance, that being capital, which is basically your standard money in an RTS, as well as energy, which is used every time that you move or attack using aircraft, naval units, or tanks. Run out of energy, and those units will stop in their tracks. While you can choose what kind of units your production structures build, the process is overall automated. And overall, this game has you focusing a lot more on macro than micro. I know it sounds weird, and for the first few minutes it feels weird, but once you get used to it, it's actually a lot of fun. And the game is highly replayable because the battlefields are procedurally generated, which is balanced out with a territory claiming system that chooses where you start. And there's also a lot of training videos that helps teach you everything from basic mechanics to more advanced strategies. Not the most elegant way, for sure, but it does teach you a lot of things I never would have thought of otherwise. The game is really fun, but there is a crucial flaw, that being, there is no single-player content. There's no campaign, and there's not even a practice AI for you to fight against in a skirmish match. And unfortunately, this is quite damning for the game because this is from an indie studio with not a lot of weight behind their name. If this were a big AAA company and an established franchise, they might have been able to get away with it. But when a lot of people don't even know who you are or that your game even exists, that means your player count in your game is going to be a lot smaller. And when you only have multiplayer to fall back on, as soon as the player base is gone, the game is fucking useless. Now, if this were an early access release, I might have been able to cut them some slack. But if you look at their Steam page, there is no early access label, meaning this is technically the full release, and I have to judge it as such. Because even if they had as little as just a practice AI, this means this game would have had fun to be had no matter what. But my ability to have fun with this game is reliant on other people playing it, and unfortunately, according to recent Steam reviews, the game is already pretty fucking dead. Now, if you have friends that you know you're gonna play this game with, then I'd recommend giving it a try. but only if you have friends that you know you're going to play the game with. Now, the developers have said that they are developing single-player content for the game, but we haven't really heard much on exactly when it's going to land. And frankly, I really don't think they should have done the full release for this game until they had at least a practice AI. It's honestly a shame that I can't unequivocally recommend this game because the gameplay is genuinely that fucking fun. But until there is single-player content in this game, I would save your money. Lion War was really held back by the lack of single-player, and Redfall was just a fucking disaster, so needless to say, I was in need of a palate cleanser. Well, luckily I wouldn't have to wait long for quite possibly the best palate cleanser I could have received. The Legend of Zelda: Tears of the Kingdom. I'm just gonna come out and say it right now, this is my game of the year. It took what was already my favorite Zelda game and just improved upon it in so many ways. Exploration is a lot more fun than it was in Breath of the Wild due to the fact that the content was more interesting and traversal was improved. And the fact that there are basically 3 worlds to explore is honestly quite impressive. Now, going into this, I knew about the Sky Islands. I did not, however, know about the depths until I was flying around on my paraglider, realized, hey, I wonder what would happen if I tried falling down the center of these gloom holes so that way I don't take damage from them. And I just kept falling until I eventually arrived in the depths, which just completely blew me away. Now, I didn't look at every single piece of marketing, but I'd imagine that this is what kids in the 90s must have felt like when they first discovered the Dark World in A Link to the Past. Puzzle solving was also greatly improved because there are just so many different ways you can solve them and they're all satisfying. I remember when I saw my brother playing this game whenever I wasn't, and oftentimes whenever he'd be doing a shrine that I've already completed, the solution that he found was completely different from the one I found. It also helps that there are some new mechanics to help out with that as well, namely the build mechanic and the GoldenEye devices, which were incredibly creative and honestly a ton of fun. This ties into basically every aspect of the game. Combat, exploration, puzzle solving, you name it. Speaking of combat, that's been improved as well. Something about the way the fuse mechanic works makes it so that it's not incredibly frustrating for my weapons to be breaking as quickly as they do. Not to mention, you can make some pretty interesting weapon combinations with the fuse mechanic. While I admittedly have some issues with the game, notably the dips in performance, the lackluster story, the broken nature of the healing mechanic, and of course the dungeon design falling into the exact same pitfall Breath of the Wild did, but the positives far outweigh the negatives. For the most part, it's what I've wanted out of a sequel to Breath of the Wild, and I do hope we continue to get more 3D Zelda games like this, although next time we definitely need a new open world. I do think the changes to Breath of the Wild's open world are fine enough here, but I don't think it'll work for a third game. But by far, Tears of the Kingdom is my favorite new game this year, and also my favorite Zelda game. Around this time, a friend of mine, Brother Near 2.0, introduced me to a free-to-play movement shooter called Redmatch 2. So you know that unwritten rule that grappling hooks just make every game better? Well, Redmatch 2 decided to double down on it. Literally, you get 2 grapple hooks, it's really fun. Something else that's pretty cool is you earn a token each time you get a kill, and you can spend them at these terminals around the map to improve your health, speed, and jump height. Every time you die, though, you lose a point that you invested into one of these categories. It's a very interesting gameplay loop, I just wish there was more content. It's balanced around having 4 guns, which I think are all pretty satisfying, even if a bit basic, and I find the maps to be pretty well designed. Overall, I'd recommend it to anybody. It's free to play on Steam, and there's usually roughly around 500 or so players playing at any given time. I pretty much never have trouble finding an open match. But whoop-de-doo, it's fun, let's move on. Now, last year I had a really good time playing Dark Souls 1 Remastered and Elden Ring, and it was around this time I was hungering for some more of that Souls action. So I decided to set up the RPCS3 emulator on my PC and play through Demon Souls. Well, when I say play through, I haven't finished it yet, but I've gotten around somewhere between a third and a half of the way through the game. I will say it was a very interesting juxtaposition going from Elden Ring, the most recent and refined Souls game, to Demon Souls, the very first one. I started out with a Dex build, but I quickly transitioned to more of a magic build as I found something called the Crescent Falchion, which scales with your magic stat rather than your dex stat, and so I just sort of picked up sorcery as a secondary option to use. Combat is, well, it's standard Souls fare. If you like it, you like it. If you don't, you don't. Bosses are pretty standard. I wouldn't really say there's anything I fought that quite reaches the heights of something like Ornstein and Smo, but there also isn't anything as dickish annoying as the Bed of Chaos. I've heard some people complain about the Flame Lurker, and while I definitely think he's the hardest boss I've fought so far, he's not really a bad boss. I actually had a lot of fun fighting him. Granted, maybe there might be more standout examples in the latter half of the game, but I just haven't gotten to it yet. That's not to say it's perfect. There is a really awkward platforming section in the Stone Fang Tunnel, which I really don't get why Souls games like to insert platforming unnecessarily when the controls are just not designed for it at all. However, I think the bigger issue is the grass system. See, from Dark Souls onwards, you have the Estus system, which I think is a great healing system, where you have 5 or so flasks to heal with, but you get them back every time you rest at a bonfire, but of course doing so also respawns all the enemies. Demon Souls, however, has a more level-based structure, and the healing system is a more standard RPG fare, where the grasses are your healing items, and they're basically a standard consumable. The thing is, though, once you use it, it's gone, and the only way to get more is to either kill an enemy that drops one, or to buy more from a merchant. And because of the way checkpoints work, if you use a bunch of grass to heal yourself, but then you die, you don't have that grass anymore when you respawn. Which means you're inevitably going to run into a situation where you have to repeatedly kill enemies either to farm grass directly, or to farm souls, which you can use to buy grass. Which is particularly ignominious in a game like Demon Souls, which makes Trial and Error Challenge its main focus. It's not like farming out a bunch of easy enemies for souls to get grass is fun or engaging on its own, and it just sort of leads to a similar problem that the first Metroid game on the NES had, although admittedly to a lesser extent. Clearly, though, Miyazaki and the team at From Software learned from this because the healing systems going forward were far better. Speaking of which, that wasn't the only Souls game I played this year, as when the Steam Summer Sale rolled around, I picked up Dark Souls 2 and Dark Souls 3, although I haven't played Dark Souls 3 yet, but I did play Dark Souls 2, specifically the Scholar of the First Sin edition, because the original release requires a 32-bit PC, which I don't have, and of course, while the Xbox 360 version is available, it's not backwards compatible. So, Scholar of the First Sin it is. Overall, I definitely think I had more fun with this game than I did with Demon Souls, as there are some more mechanics that I think are pretty cool. Namely, power wielding. Holy shit, this is fun. It allows you to dual wield 2 different melee weapons and attack with them both in rapid succession, which is really fucking cool. Also, you can now put both weapons and shields in either hand instead of having to put weapons in your right hand and shields in your left. Something I found to be an odd limitation in Dark Souls 1 when I kept hitting the walls in certain scenarios. Plus, you got 3 slots for each hand instead of just 2, which is nice. Much like with Demon Souls, I found the bosses to be pretty standard. There wasn't really as many that stood out like in Dark Souls 1 or Elden Ring, but again, I haven't found anything that quite reaches the lows of something like the Bed of Chaos. Of course, I haven't finished this game yet either, so that might change later on, though I do think the bosses that I did fight were overall more interesting than Demon Souls. Probably my favorite ones that I've fought so far are the Ruined Sentinels and Scorpionus Najka, however the fuck you pronounce that. And again, it's Souls combat. If you like it, you like it. If you don't, you don't. Of course, I do think there are a few issues with the game. For one, I find that drinking Estus is just incredibly slow for some reason, which just makes the game kind of sluggish at times. Additionally, you only start the game with 1 Estus flask, and instead you have to rely on life gems to heal yourself for the first few hours, which, again, are completely consumable, much like the grass in Demon Souls. Although, thankfully, enemies drop them frequently enough that I never really felt like I had to grind here, though I do think that the Estus system from Dark Souls 1 was just better. Thankfully, once you get a few hours into the game, you'll have plenty of Estus flasks, so it ceases to be an issue. There's also another issue where the effectiveness of your dodge roll is reliant on your adaptability stat, and the only reason that it was never a problem for me is because prior to playing the game, I had heard all the bitching online. In other words, I knew ahead of time that I needed to dump some points into the stat so I could stay immobile. One more issue is that the intro cutscene was completely broken for me for some reason, though that might just be because I'm playing it on the Steam Deck. Then again, this game is listed as deck verified, so I don't know how that got past the testers, but maybe it's just a me issue for some reason. Now, from what I've heard overall, I've heard that this is generally considered to be the worst of the Souls games, and that might just be because of something past the point that I've played, because much like with Demon Souls, I haven't completed the game yet. From what I have played, though, I definitely enjoy it more than Demon Souls, though not as much as something like Dark Souls Remastered or Elden Ring, but still pretty fun overall. The other game that I picked up during the Steam Summer Sale that I've played so far is Dusk. It's a retro-style arena shooter that takes a lot of inspiration from Half-Life, but more so Quake. And it's fun. The level design is fantastic, the enemy design is fantastic, the weapons are really fun to use, and there's also an endless mode that unfortunately only has 3 levels to pick from, but the combat in this game is pretty fun. And yet, for one reason or another, I didn't really sink a lot of time into this game. I really don't know why. It's kind of hard to point out actual flaws with the game. I mean, the only real flaw that I find is that for some reason this game just can't seem to lock to 144 FPS at 1080p, even with low spec mode enabled, which there's really no reason why it shouldn't be able to, seeing as I have an i7-10750H, an RTX 2060, and 16GB of RAM in my laptop, which, looking at the system requirements on Steam, is pretty fucking overkill for this game. I don't know, maybe there's some weird setting in Windows causing it, I don't fucking know. Still, it's not like the frame rate ever drops to unplayable levels. I've never seen it dip below 60. And even then, I don't really think it's the performance deterring me. The game is fun. There's not really many genuine flaws with the game I can really think of. It's just, for whatever reason, it just didn't really captivate me. But I'm willing to chalk it up to just being a me issue rather than an issue with the game itself. Because Dusk is a really good game, and I would definitely recommend it to anybody who's a fan of arena shooters. Here's a sentence I've never said before, and probably never will again. I want to give a huge shout out to Under the Mayo. Because if it wasn't for his god-awful video shitting on Trepang 2, I don't think I ever would have bought and played it. And that would have sucked because Trepang 2 is fucking awesome. It's a game that takes inspiration from F.E.A.R. and adds a bunch of its own ideas to make it its own unique combat loop. It's a very fast-paced game where sliding and constantly moving is very important. You got abilities like the cloak and the focus ability, which can be used defensively but can just as easily be used offensively. The enemy AI is also really impressive. While I still think that F.E.A.R.'s AI is overall better, Trepang 2's AI is no fucking slouch either. These guys are genuinely fun to fight. I can't really think of a single arena that wasn't memorable. There's only 6 main missions and 6 side missions, but each of them pack a lot of punch. It's a fairly short game, as my first playthrough on hard only took me about 8.5 hours, which included the side missions. But it was a really fun 8.5 hours. Plus, the game is insanely replayable. The story is functional, there really isn't too much to say here outside of a twist that occurs near the end of the game, which admittedly I saw coming from a mile away. But overall, I think there are some pretty cool psychological horror elements as you uncover the dastardly experiments of the Horizon Corporation. The main missions are structured similar to a Call of Duty campaign mission, except the difference there is that Trepang 2 actually has an interesting combat loop. Meanwhile, the side missions are wave-based challenges where you have to complete some objective while fending off waves of enemies. And to round out the package, there's a combat simulator, which is basically a horde mode. And recently, there was the Survival Mode DLC, which basically has you on a timer, and you have to complete objectives to earn food in order to add time to that timer. And it also added some new equipment. The weapons are all pretty satisfying to use. Admittedly, I would have liked it if there was like 1 or 2 sci-fi-esque weapons, kind of like the Type 2 particle beam from F.E.A.R., given that the overall setting is quite similar to F.E.A.R. The equipment is also really fun to use. There's shit like rat bombs, gas grenades, flashbangs, etc. And frankly, I think this is the best indie game I've played this year. At first I would have thought that might have been Everspace 2, but I find myself coming back to Trepang 2 a lot more often. The game is $30 on Steam, and not too long ago it got ported to PS5 and Xbox Series consoles. My advice is, buy the game and play it, because it's fucking amazing. Well, now it's time to turn back the clock to 1997, because Night Dive Studios released a remaster of Quake II. I've never played the original Quake II, but playing this remaster, it's a lot of fun. Having a consumable system in an arena shooter is an interesting choice, but it surprisingly works quite well. I also think the weapon and enemy sandbox is a lot more fun to play around with than it was in Quake 1, and also it just feels cleaner to play than Quake 1 was. Especially Call of the Machine, holy shit, this is a lot more polished than the main campaign. Soundtrack is really cool, and while I definitely still like the 9 Inch Nails soundtrack from Quake 1, I think the heavy metal riffs of Sonic Mayhem's soundtrack in Quake 2 just fit the gameplay a lot better. And I overall enjoyed the multiplayer more than I did in Quake 1. It feels a lot more polished. It's not perfect. I do think some enemies in the campaign are just a bit bullet spongy for my liking, especially those dog-looking things that shoot tentacles at you. But it's overall an excellent remaster of an old classic. So Prey Mooncrash isn't exactly its own game, but rather it's a DLC for Prey, which I played last year. But when I bought the PC version of the game so I could play it on my Steam Deck, it came with the Mooncrash DLC on top of it, so I decided, what the fuck, I'll give it a try. And if I'm being honest, I think I had more fun with this DLC than I did with the base game, because Prey Mooncrash takes the survival horror gameplay of the base game and turns it into a roguelike. And honestly, the way that Prey Mooncrash does it puts Deathloop to fucking shame. The game takes place in a simulation of what happened on the Pythias moon base, which is also controlled by the Transtar Corporation. And what's interesting is that each run consists of 5 parts, one for each of the 5 different characters. The goal is for each character to escape while also completing certain objectives. levels. When you escape with a certain character, then you select the next one and continue the simulation. Same thing happens if you die. Once you used all 5 characters in a single run, the simulation will reset. This is actually quite interesting for several reasons. Number one, each character has their own different playstyle, whereas in the base game you could sort of tailor whatever playstyle you wanted. Mooncrash, however, forces you to tackle its challenges in different ways. If there's a locked door, you can't hack your way in there unless you're playing on the character that has that ability, whereas in the base game, once you unlock the hacking neuromod, you don't have to worry about it anymore. It also adds a new aspect to resource management. In the base game, there's really no reason not to pick up everything you find outside of limited bag space. In Mooncrash, however, if you decide to pick up every single piece of loot you come across with one character, that means it won't be there for the next character, and so you might find yourself under-equipped to deal with the threats. It creates this sort of game within a game where you ask yourself, is it better to pick this up now to make this easier on this current run, or should I leave it so another character later can use it? It's an interesting balancing act, because if you pick up too much equipment as one character, it means when you play as the other characters, it won't be there, and you might find yourself woefully underprepared. If you pick up too little, however, you'll find your current character to be woefully underprepared. And then, of course, there's also the increasing corruption. The more time progresses, the higher the corruption level gets, which means more difficult enemies and hazards, which in turn gets you to take more risks. Because if you go too slow, it means that your subsequent characters are going to have a really hard time. But if you go too fast, you might just get yourself killed. Much like with the loot system, it's a very interesting balancing act that works really well. And overall, I think it works really well with the gameplay that the base game had. The only thing I found particularly annoying were the traumas. They were an option you could enable in the base game, but they're always present here. And some of these are straight up annoying, like the bleed one causes you to constantly drain health if you're sprinting, sliding, or jumping, which, given how often you gotta do that in this, it can get real fucking annoying, especially if you don't have the item that you need to heal that trauma. Thankfully, other traumas, like burn for example, isn't as annoying, but it definitely could have been tuned a bit better. Also, much like the base game, I find the story is functional, but not standout, though there are a few interesting moments, such as a big reveal with a certain character. Overall, Prey Mooncrash is an excellent expansion upon the already great base game. Alright, so for this next game, I should state that I am not an RPG guy. With most RPGs I play, I have trouble putting more than 6 to 8 hours in them because I usually just get bored and want to go play something else. It's why I haven't bought and played Baldur's Gate 3 yet. It's also why I'm surprised that I managed to put a full 45 hours into Starfield. I'm gonna be honest, if it wasn't for the fact that it was on Game Pass, I don't think I would have played this game. And what do I think of Starfield? Well, it's very weird. When I look at this game as a whole, for all intents and purposes, I should hate it. The FPS combat is very basic, the enemy variety leaves a lot to be desired, and the enemy AI is, let's just say, less than average. The space combat I think is better overall, but it's definitely nothing too deep. It really doesn't hold a candle to Everspace 2 in this regard. What about the exploration? I mean, there's 1,000 planets. Well, the procedurally generated planets are not that interesting to explore, as they have quite possibly the worst instance of the Far Cry problem I've ever seen. So much time is just spent running across a barren expanse to the points of interest, which are very much copy and pasted. You can mine resources, but I didn't really have much fun doing it, and so I just didn't really do much of it. The only times I really went out of my way to do so is if I needed something to craft certain weapon mods. And that already I didn't really enjoy that much, so God forbid I tried to do something like build outposts, which I didn't really engage with it. I mean, I tried once, but there was just something about it that put me off, and as such, the only thing I really used the outpost markers for was to mark spots where I just dumped a bunch of contraband. The story is alright, I think that does a few interesting things, like the Unity, for example, but I didn't find it particularly gripping either. What about the handcrafted content? Well, it's better overall, but I don't think there's enough of it. Most of the quests boil down to just go here, talk to somebody, kill something, or grab something, and then come back for a reward. This might have been fine enough if the core gameplay was a lot more engaging, but seeing as this is an RPG and the core gameplay is just passable, the quest design is really lackluster. The only one that really stood out to me was the Crimson Fleet faction quest. It's also annoying that there are so many NPCs which are straight up unkillable outside of certain story segments, which makes the game feel very limited when it's supposed to be about freedom. I mean, hell, there was a moment during the Crimson Fleet side quest where I get betrayed by the UC Sysdef guy, I forget his fucking name, but I was supposed to be infiltrating him, but he didn't like the fact that I killed some people in self-defense. So I just picked the option to attack him, but he wouldn't fucking die. I mean, the only things I can really say about Starfield Starfield that are actually really good is, number one, the sheer breadth of it, and number two, the ship customization I think is really fucking cool. But a lot of the mechanics just lack depth. The phrase I've often heard to describe this game, and one that I wholeheartedly agree with, is wide as an ocean, deep as a puddle. Now granted, a big part of the appeal of a lot of Bethesda games is apparently the mod support, and given how wide it is in scope, I think it'll be an excellent base for modding because a lot of the underlying systems are already in place, but as an out-of-the-box experience, it's quite lackluster. Given how much I just ragged on the game, for all intents and purposes, I should fucking hate it. And yet, for some reason, there's something about this game that I found appealing. What exactly did I find so appealing? Well, I'm gonna be honest, I don't fucking know. Maybe it's that Bethesda magic that I hear about, but whatever it was, it hooked me enough to put 45 hours into this game and beat the main quest, which is more than I can say for most other RPGs I've played. I also think the concept for New Game Plus is actually really fucking cool as it ties into the story, but the main problem is that you don't keep anything from your previous run except for your skills and your powers. Everything else gets reset, and it was at that point where I basically just stopped playing the game and I haven't come back to it since. Look, I don't regret the time that I spent playing Starfield, but it's definitely a deeply flawed game to the point where I couldn't even find any issues with Under the Mayo's review of it, or Synthetic Man's review of it for that matter. Well, besides the whole wokeness and video game shit, but, you know, it's Synthetic Man. This is a game that I would not blame anybody for fucking despising, but I enjoyed the game. There's really nothing I can do about it. Having said that, though, I doubt I'll ever come back to this game ever again. Alright, so technically this year isn't the first time I played Titanfall 2, but the reason I'm going to be talking about it here is because I didn't really play much of the multiplayer. I think I only touched it for about an hour when I first bought the game in 2020, and the reason for that is because due to EA Origin fucking up, there was an issue where the game would constantly crash at startup, and by the time I fixed it, the servers for this game were fucked, so I could only really play the campaign. But EA and Respawn finally got off their ass and fixed the servers, so the multiplayer was playable once again. And holy fuck, I was really missing out. The game is basically, what if we took an advanced movement Call of Duty game and made it fucking amazing? The movement mechanics are so clean and the map design complements it perfectly. I love how it incorporates both PvP and PvE, as there are certain AI-controlled units on both sides. The weapons are great, the abilities are great, and of course, there's the Titans. While you unlock the Titans in a similar ability to something like an ultimate, it's also not an immediate power spike, at least not in the traditional sense. Yes, you have armor, and yes, your weapons are more powerful, but you're also big and slow, and a skilled pilot will still kill you very easily if you're not careful. I still haven't found my number one favorite Titan yet, though I keep switching between Scorch and Monarch. Also, fuck Ronin mains. But yeah, I definitely think Titanfall 2 will become one of the main multiplayer games I play on a regular basis. If you haven't played it yet, seriously, go check it out. It's fucking amazing. Survival horror is a genre that's slowly been growing on me, ever since I first played BioShock 2 years ago, and then last year when I played Prey. So when I saw that the Dead Space remake was added to Game Pass, I figured, why not give it a try? Now, I've never played any of the original Dead Space games, and I didn't really know much about it outside the fact that it was survival horror, so I wasn't sure what to expect going into it, but what I found was a game with quite a lot of depth. Instead of aiming for the head and center mass of the necromorphs, you instead have to dismember their limbs off one by one. Which I find pretty cool because shooting the limbs of something running at you is actually pretty fucking challenging. And I love the implications behind it as well, as if the necromorph isn't truly dead, it doesn't truly die, you just take away any ability it has to further pursue and attack you. I think they did the enemy design just right in this game. There aren't too many to be overwhelming, they each serve a different role, and the way you take them out is different. I find that the weapon sandbox is also really cool. There's only like 6 weapons in the game that I know of, but they're all distinct from each other, and they're really fun to use. Alright, so this is Thunderstruck from the future. Something I didn't learn until recently is that there's actually a 7th weapon in the game that I somehow completely missed on my initial playthrough called the Line Gun. And I'm not sure if this is meant to be an optional weapon or if I just am a complete sped and I didn't notice it. But I'll be sure to look for it on my next playthrough, which, yeah, I'm definitely going to be playing this game again. I like the way that they're contextualized in the game. Not all of them are overtly weapons. Like the Plasma Cutter feels more like a tool that you're using using as a weapon. Same goes for the Ripper, the Force Gun, and the Contact Beam. This is a mining vessel after all. The story I think is pretty good, but not too standout. Like, the big twist at the end is something I saw coming from a mile away, mainly because of the way that a certain character was acting. And the final boss, while I think is decent, was a little bit underwhelming, but the game was overall a really fun experience. Since I'd never played a Dead Space game prior to this, I picked normal, which I found to be a little bit too easy in the early sections of the game, but became sufficiently challenging later on, and in the last few chapters of the game, I found that I was actually struggling quite a bit, but in a good way. Outside of 2 Kaizo tentacles in that one cargo base section, the game never really felt unfair. But when I do replay this game, it'll be on a harder difficulty. When it comes to the horror elements, I don't really ever recall being overtly scared, but then again, I think that's just because I don't really scare easy, at least not from video games. But I did find the atmosphere generally tense. The game is also pretty damn immersive. The HUD elements are all contextualized in-game, either being a function on Isaac's suit or an ammo display on your weapons. A small detail to be sure, but one I can appreciate. Granted, I'm not entirely sure how different this is compared to the original Dead Space from 2008. Like, I know the ship here is all interconnected instead of being level-based, the weapons are given to you directly instead of having blueprints to buy them from the store, and the way zero gravity works was completely redone, but I don't really know what was changed outside of that. As such, I can't really say for sure if it's worth a full $70, seeing as it is a remake of a 15-year-old game, but it was still really damn fun. Alright, so for Half-Life's 25th anniversary, Valve pushed out an update and was giving the game away for free for a few days, and I completely missed it. But during the Steam Black Friday sale, they did make it available for 99 cents, which, let me just say, that was a wonderful way to get my bank to contact me about suspicious activity on my account. But Half-Life, when it released back in 1998, it was a very influential title for first-person shooters, and playing it today, it's a good game. I do find that it has a bit of a tendency to overindulge itself with certain set pieces, but at the same time, when you consider that this was something new for first-person shooters back in 1998, it makes sense within the context of the time it released. Combat, for the most part, is pretty good. Specifically when fighting against the creature enemies, it's fast-paced arena shooter combat, similar to Quake, though not quite as fast. Human enemies are a bit of a mixed bag for 2 reasons, though. Number 1, the AI is definitely fucking dated. They can't do more than one thing at once. They're either move or they shoot. Though, admittedly, I do like the fact that they do try to flank you instead of just running straight into your line of fire, which is nice. The other problem that I have with human enemies, and this is far more pronounced, is that they are way too fucking bullet spongy. Like, it takes half of a fucking magazine from my SMG to kill them, and hell, one of them was even able to survive 5 shotgun blasts at close range. 5! It doesn't pair well with the fact that they can kill you pretty quickly, which I'd be fine with if they weren't so goddamn bullet spongy, which kind of runs counter to the whole arena shooter style combat that this game is going for. And maybe the intention is to get you to adopt a slower playstyle against them, but I just don't find it to be anywhere near as fun. Thankfully, the rest of the enemies that I fought so far are pretty damn fun, especially those ninja guys that show up about halfway through the game, which definitely play to the game's strengths a lot more. Now, I haven't completed the entire game yet, so I can't really say too much about the story as a whole, but honestly, up to this point, it's passable. It's your typical science guys fuck up an experiment and summon a bunch of creatures that are hostile, so the government sends in a bunch of Marines to cover up the mess. I haven't really found any characters that are particularly memorable. In fact, I don't really even know any of their names besides Gordon Freeman, who's the guy that you play as. One other thing I wanted to mention about this game is that the physics are really fucking jank. Like, you know how in Halo CE, if you touch a barely moving vehicle, even if it's going pretty slow, you die instantly? Well, Half-Life has the same problem, except it's with damn near every physics object. In fact, there was a certain section where I needed to take an elevator to get to the next part of the level, but half the time when the elevator started moving, it would just straight up kill me, which, needless to say, is fucking annoying. There's also this pretty long platforming segment that happens about halfway through the game, which, honestly, it's not to the strengths of this game. Despite that, though, I still think Half-Life has some merit and warrants being played through today, especially seeing as you can get the game for pretty cheap nowadays. I wouldn't really say it's a masterpiece, but it was definitely very revolutionary. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is the overview of the games that I played this year. Now, I didn't include games that I played in previous years or that I still play somewhat regularly, because I don't really think there's too much to say there. Overall, my favorite game that released this year was Tears of the Kingdom, whereas my favorite game that I first played this year that released in years prior was probably DMC5 Special Special Edition. Although, if you don't want to count that, seeing as I did play the original last year, then I'd say my next pick would probably be F.E.A.R. Best indie game I played this year was Trepang 2, although I think Everspace 2 is a close second. And the worst game I played this year was Redfall. Overall, I really liked what I played this year. But with that, we have reached the end of the video, so if you enjoyed, make sure you hit the like button and subscribe for more, and tell me what you think of the games I played this year, and tell me what games you played this year, and if you like them or not. Anyways, I hope you all have a Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year. I don't know if I'll get any other uploads out before the new year, so I just wanted to say it now just in case. But anyways, that's it. Peace!